Welcome everybody to the second in the series of conversations I'm having with with some of the people I think are at the forefront of the sector's leadership. Now, in the last session, I spoke with Mike Adamson and Juliet Bouverie about why systems change is such an important topic, why we need to demystify it, start sharing what we're learning, and today we're going to build on that a little bit by talking about what actually follows when you start to take systems change more seriously. And I think the phrase that Matt Downey said to me once, which is, what comes next once you've said you mean it? So we're going to be exploring that in the exceptionally fine company of two, close your ears, absolute icons of the sector, Polly Neate and Kate Lee. Now, I can't believe that I have to introduce either of you because I'm sure you're so well known, but just for the record. So Polly has been chief exec of housing and homeless charity Shelter for just coming up 7 years, I read. Before that, she was chief exec of Women's Aid. She's a trustee of Young Women's Trust and Women in Sport and a lifelong activist for women's rights and social justice. And Polly, correct me if I'm wrong, you were quoted in The Spectator as saying, if people aren't angry with me, I'm not doing my job properly. Is that right?
New Statesman, but other than that, it's
New
totally
Statesman.
accurate, yes.
It's quite a quote. I think it's brilliant. So thank you for joining us. And Kate is the chief exec of Alzheimer Society. Before that, chief exec of Young Lives versus Cancer, co-founded the Children and Young People's Cancer Coalition, also a trustee of World Child Cancer and advisor to Copperfield. And Kate, we've been working together for about 3 years now, but you started at Alzheimer's literally when COVID hit. I remember The Guardian was writing every other week about toxic culture. Staff surveys were through the floor, and now 4.5 years later, you win the Charity Year Award. And from what Corinne said, you're getting like 100 applicants for every vacancy. So that's quite a serious turnaround. Well done, you and the team, obviously.
And the team, definitely.
So it's wonderful to have you both here. Anyway, flattery's done. I've ticked that box. We're going to talk about the implications once we set out on this journey of systems change. But before we get to that, I just to get a baseline, to Polly, that phrase systems change, what does it mean for you? Why is it relevant for your organization?
I mean, I've got to say, first of all, I just want to do a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on system change at all. I'm not a massively academically inclined person. So what I say it means to me probably isn't the actual real definition of it. But what it means to me is not being part of damaging cycles if we can possibly avoid it. That's what it means to me. So basically that we're not just picking up the pieces, we are intervening in the system's failure or trying to intervene in it that leads people to, in my case, seek help from Shelter. And I guess for me, it is the reason the reason I've done the jobs I've done is because I really passionately believe that we blame and stigmatize people for what is actually the failure of systems to treat them anywhere approaching properly, never mind generously. And the only one thing I'd add to that is that I think there's another thing about it, which is about, to use the really popular phrase, lived experience, which is that it's really important that people's experiences and stories, that they have to sometimes quite painfully recount to an organisation like Shelter or indeed Women's Aid when I was working there. I think it's really important that we enable that to go somewhere. So we're not only are we not just picking up the pieces, but we're also not hearing stories of system failure and not allowing those stories to have as much impact as possible. So that's what it means to me.
Yeah. No, I think that's just coming on one point that you mentioned there about the academic definition. When I started to look at this, I got this book It's still on my desk. I've almost made it to the end of chapter 1. The
Well, that's more
academic
than I've read
stuff.
of any book about systems
But,
change.
but what
So,
I've found is
I'm
it's really
impressed with that,
unhelpful because
Martin.
it
Like,
confuses everything.
seriously.
Yeah, yeah. No, the way that you explained it is so much more accessible than most of the stuff that I've ever read. So I appreciate, what you said, but I value your thoughts, I think, probably more than you think. I'll just sort of bring it to Kate. How does that resonate with you? Because your organization is probably in a different space to Polly's. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think very similarly to Polly, I think we fundamentally work in charities because it's this positioning about believing that we can either do good in the moment, but we will always be doing good in the moment, and demand will always outstrip supply, or we can try and get upstream. So what are the levers that are causing these problems downstream? What is causing people with dementia to live such crap lives? What's creating that? It is generally exactly as Polly says, that the system around them just isn't functioning properly. It's not connected. People aren't giving this work the priority it needs. We're not thinking about the health inequalities. That means some people experience this differently. So it's because the system's damaged. It's not about the individual at the end that needs the support. So unless we really try to pull ourselves back and think like upstream, what can we change in the system? What can we trigger in the system to mean that in 5 years time or 10 years time or 15 years time it's not still like this? Because if we just sit back and keep delivering services, the demand for those services over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years is going to grow exponentially. They'll just reach a point that we're reaching less and less people, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy however amazing we are. And I think and something we might want to get into later for me, but I've been wrestling a lot with recently, is how this thinking about system change fits with the way that we're funded, particularly those of us, many of us, like Polly as well, that have a lot of voluntary income and fundraised income. Donors don't want to be paying £1 forever. They want to know there's a solution to this problem, but equally they don't necessarily like funding system change. So I think there's a conundrum in here that I find quite interesting about whether we've even got the right model to do some of this system change stuff that we might want to talk about.
It's that the Desmond Tutu quote, isn't it? Pulling people out of the river versus going upstream. But when a lot of commissioning and that sort of thing is based on almost like per head pulling people out of the river, it's quite difficult to find a way. I mean, is this something that's relevant for you, Polly?
Yeah, I mean, so there's two different and parallel funding problems there, isn't there? So I think in terms of commissioning, which often is local, and we've had this situation in shelter. So you can be in a situation where you are literally being paid by the system that's causing the problem to do enough of a job at ameliorating the problem that the problem can carry on. So you are literally part of, and I suppose that's what I was talking about not feeding damaging cycles. You can literally end up part of that cycle of damage and broken systems. So there's that. People, very few public sector funders, although actually there are a couple, but in the main, very few public funders want to fund charities to fundamentally challenge them. That's just not, they don't even have the resources for that, frankly, when you think about the situation local authorities are in. So that's that. Then on the other hand, yes, I mean, when you're talking about voluntary income, which very luckily at Shelter, we are in the main, the vast majority of our income is voluntary income. But yes, I mean, it's much more difficult to get donors to fund work. Most donors want to fund service delivery. Having said all of that, we're actually really privileged at Shelter because we are so known as a campaigning organisation, and have been for a long time. and we're pretty vocal and out there as a campaigning organisation, a lot of our donors actually do get it. They do want to be part of, they want to be part of us because we are not afraid to speak truth to power, and we are directly challenging broken systems and being quite vocal about that. But I think that is quite a privileged position to be in, you know, with an organisation like Shelter attracts supporters that are like that, and not all charities do.
Yeah. I think it that has a really wide relevance. It's the sort of rescuer model, isn't it? That people want to pay for that sort of rescuing, and whereas the upstream prevention is much more difficult. And
yes, and I mean, rescuing, even if you're not doing systems change, the whole paradigm of rescuing and kind of people with more privilege rescuing people with less privilege is just not a good place for this, a good look for the sector anyway. So that's right. And so I kind of think wherever you are on this journey from rescuing to system change, or whatever you want to call it, I think the whole sector needs to be asking questions about, which it is doing, by the way, but the sector does need to be really reflecting on the kind of rescuing paradigm for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'd completely agree with that, because I think there are issues about who we rescue and how we rescue them, and whether actually that is a sustainable model. Because what happens when we can't rescue them? So what happens when the money runs out? You know, we don't leave people in a stronger position than they're in. But I think actually proving impact, this is something that Juliet and Mike talked about last time, which really triggered something for me. Proving impact of working upstream is quite hard. And so being able to say, you know, we just recently had a really big policy win in dementia. But it was really interesting when we went back to talk to some of our donors, and we put it in our newsletter and whatever, you know, look at this change that we've been lobbying for, and the government is changing it. Like, the feedback we got was, oh, you've spent our money on getting the government to do something they should have been doing. It's like, yeah, but they don't do it. It's like, yeah, but they don't. It does need someone to point them out. And yeah, that's costly, because generating the evidence to make them change their mind, you know, proving that there's a huge cost attached to that. It's not just, you know, write a letter to the PM saying, could you do more of this? So also, I think a lot of donors don't always understand the implications of some of that system change policy campaigning work. So the impact becomes quite hard to prove. So like aligning that up is more complex. And then I think there's the whole balance piece about, and again, I think this was touched on last time, but I found really interesting about, so you've got to do some rescuing and you've got to do some upstream. How do you get the balance right in your organization between the two?
Yeah, it's a mindset around, you know, the need to rescue, as opposed to, you know, the fact that what we are doing is we're picking up problems which a system has created. And one of the interesting things for me in all these conversations is, you know, the courses are very different. The systems that you're talking about are quite different, but there's so much consistency in how we understand that it is a dysfunctional system, how we work out where we can target and influence and change that system to the extent that we can, and the consistent sets of challenges that flow from that. And we'll come on to the challenges before we get there, if it's okay, just because I'm always kind of slightly mindful that if I lead with all the challenges, then everybody goes, oh, God, is it worth it? So before we get to that, the kind of is it worth it question, I mean, just bring it to life. Are there one or two examples that you point to within your own sphere that you know that exemplified this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I can kick off with a couple from us. I mean, and they may be a little bit different to what people are thinking about, because I think it's not, I think when we talk about system change, it's quite easy to get into or slip into, maybe not for everyone, particularly for those people whose organizations are more activist and more about system change. You probably don't do this as much, but when you're a bit like mine, where you've got a big chunk of service delivery, a big chunk of research, and a big chunk of kind of this system change influencing work, it's easy to think about the influencing work just slipping completely into like lobbying government. But actually, I think there's so many more aspects to it than that. So a couple of things that we've been doing. One is that we've been really looking at the triggers of poor healthcare for people with dementia. Why do people with dementia, when they're accessing healthcare, have such a poor experience? Why, when they're accessing things like social care, hearing, clinics, speech and language therapy, why is it so poor for people with dementia? And we know that there's a big issue about the experience of the healthcare professionals working with them, who might be brilliant in their own right, but have no experience of delivering their service in the context of someone with a severe cognitive impairment. So we've launched a service. We've been running it for 10 years now. We've just had an evaluation of it called Time for Dementia, where we've been getting in with universities that train healthcare professionals. And we've been buddying up first year healthcare professionals. So that's medical, all clinical, increasingly social care, most occupational therapists, quite a lot of their allied health professionals. They get buddied with a family with dementia. They for 2 years, they have to make 6 visits in 2 years to that family, physically to their home, to experience what it's like to have someone with dementia. They spend an hour or a couple of hours with them. We've been running it for 10 years. And what we've shown is that the students that are now kind of 2 or 3, 4 years into their professional careers, we've been doing some tracking, looking at the quality of the experience of people with dementia that are under those healthcare professionals, and it is significantly higher. So what we're seeing there is, from that intervention through our Time for Dementia programming, getting in really early, just with a very experiential, it's not an academic experience of dementia, it's not a taught in class experience, but with a really experiential dementia experience. What we're seeing now, and the evaluation, it's taken 10 years. These are long time investments, relatively small study, but we're seeing a significant improvement in the quality of healthcare provision in and around some of those southwest areas where we've been running this program now. So again, it's like thinking about some of the improvements in the quality of care are going to happen from small changes that can be made now. And similarly, we're investing at the moment in we're doing some investment work with early career researchers. So how do we encourage people, when they're deciding what research career to go into, to choose dementia and not choose cancer? And so we've been doing loads of work. And again, that's getting upstream, because we need the future Nobel Prize winners in dementia. We're only going to get that if we can encourage early career researchers into dementia now. But it's a 10, 20, 30 year output for the impact of those investments. So they're relatively small, but it's just different to that traditional kind of lobbying work.
Fantastic. Polly?
So I'm trying to sort of think what to pick. So the approach that we've taken, and this has been going on since we launched our strategy in 2019, is employing community organisers in all of our local hubs. So everywhere where we have a service delivery presence, we also have an explicitly activist organising presence. And so, and we've made a decision that, everything that those activists, those organisers help to generate, because they're not generating it, the communities are generating it, but everything that they help to generate doesn't have to be branded as shelter. So a really good example, there are loads of examples, but I mean, the Birmingham Fair Housing Campaign, the Bristol Fair Rent Campaign, the Norwich Renters Campaign, all of these, you have to scratch quite a lot to know that they're kind of hosted or supported or enabled by shelter to a greater or lesser extent. And those campaigns, groups of local people are pursuing what they choose in terms of system change in their local area. So there have been quite a number of successes in terms of what they've made change. I mean, renting policy towards the private rented sector in Bristol, specific campaigns around developments in Birmingham and whether they contain social housing or not. All of these things we've tried to enable. So it starts with people who come to shelter, but it goes out much more widely than that. Another example is in Manchester. This was a while ago now, but early in our community organising journey in Manchester, we worked with local places of worship, religious communities, to commemorate people who had died while sleeping rough in Manchester. So there was a big kind of service of commemoration held, and that in turn had a big impact on the local area and helping to mobilize more people to really understand what a huge problem homelessness is in Manchester, because not so much now actually, but at that time it was really seen as a bit of a London thing. So there's lots of work. We've done work specifically around women and homelessness in Bristol, for example. And then, of course, that leads you to then engage with. So then we used peer researchers to talk to women about what services would look like that really helped to break the cycles that were impacting on their lives. And as a result of that, we came up with a kind of a blueprint for women's homelessness services that has informed our own service delivery, as well as trying to influence other agencies. So there's lots of examples. Just to say, sort of at the national level, I think one of the things that I've really tried to do to move away from is the kind of quick wins mentality that I think can be really seductive in the charity sector. And particularly, well, I'm really hoping it might be a bit different, but certainly with the last few governments that we've had, the temptation to pick a campaign or to pick a change that is easier to get, even if it won't sort the system, I think that temptation is really powerful. But actually, I think it's really important that we are absolutely truthful about what is needed in order to solve the problem, particularly with something like homelessness, because every single government goes, oh, we're going to end homelessness. But I mean, they're not. So why not? We need to be telling them that. Not going, oh, well, yeah, here's like a small thing you could do that, it's not that hard if you have a well-funded campaign machinery to get little tweaks to happen that you can then call a massive win. But I think if you really are serious about changing the system, you've got to be really honest about what really will change the system. And it isn't just about it's not all about us,
Yeah.
I think sometimes, Polly, as well, it's really that one of the roles we can play is help decision makers see that, though, because I think one of the things we've realized in dementia is actually sometimes the people who have got the opportunity to influence and change the system are just overwhelmed. They don't know where to start. Yeah. So actually saying to them, do you know what our evidence suggests? Like, crack these two things. One is a big thing, one is a little thing. Get those cracked, because that gives you an opportunity to go on to then look at this next thing. So for us in dementia, like, just get early diagnosis right. And sometimes that getting early diagnosis right might be some small wins, might be some big wins. It is going to be about more PET scanners in the NHS, but it's also about, people getting a conversation about dementia as part of their annual health checkup. Like, just crack early diagnosis, because I think sometimes, like, we talk about the system, like it knows what needs to be done, but it's resistant to it. I know. I sometimes think the system has no clue what to do.
No. So I think that that may be more true in dementia than it is in housing and homelessness, actually. I think the system's well aware of what to do.
Yeah, that's true.
But when I was talking about the sort of seductive power of small wins, I wasn't trying to say that incremental change isn't a good thing. But what I think is not a good thing is getting into this kind of loop of everybody congratulating themselves about a change that isn't really the change.
I think
that's where I think there's a bit of a trap.
It's whether are those small incremental wins taking you towards the system type changes that you need. I'm just going to pull some of this together because you given such richness of examples around there. And one of the key things for me, which got to straight away, is that systems change is not just about policy change. It's not just about the policy team and lobbying. You know, that can be an aspect of it. Well, there's so much more to it than that. And you talked about, I think from Kate talking about changing the mainstream organizations that surround the people who are being affected by this. You know, there's a huge amount of big education theme going on in there, and I see
Definitely.
this in lots of
And
different
sorry,
systems.
just to come in on that, a lot of it is poor practice. And a lot of that poor practice is itself driven by the system. So I'll give you a really obvious example of this in housing is the way people are treated when they present themselves as homeless to their local authority. Now, so there are two levels of that. So people are dehumanized, they're not taken seriously. Women fleeing domestic abuse, for example, are routinely just told, you know, we don't believe you, or go back to where you fled from, or all kinds of things, rather than accept that they're owed a homelessness duty, because the people working in that council know they don't have any resources to really do anything about it. So there's two things there, aren't there, about systems change? There's the improvement of practice. So even if you don't have something to offer somebody, you can still hear them and believe them and treat them with some dignity. And that matters. But also, it's a function of scarcity within the system. And somewhere along the line, you've got to be able to talk about that as well.
Yeah.
So yes. So I suppose what I'm saying is, sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted there. But what I'm saying is, it's about it's really important to try to change the system in terms of the practice of this, the way the system is being practiced. But you also have to think about as well that in itself has root causes a lot of the time. Most people don't go into public services to gatekeep and treat people in a miserable way. You know, they're doing it because of other pressures.
And I think that speaks a little bit to what Kate was saying. So, you know, it talks to the examples that you were giving around your community organizers, which is fantastic. And the whole kind of convening role, mobilizing role, getting the community to develop the solutions for the community, very sort of place-based. But also the things that Kate was talking around educating decision makers, because sometimes, you know, we can see that how these factors within organizations like local authorities, etc., you know, how they emerge into these problematic behaviors, and the ability to be able to, I think that's why I was so uplifted when you talked about systems in a really simple way, as opposed to getting kind of all academic and complicated. Because when we're talking to decision makers, politicians, etc., you kind of need to break it down and say, you know, this is step one and this is step two, and the reason that you do them in that order is because this is what happens, just in really sort of simple language. So I think there's a lot of commonality in what you're both saying there. And the question that it brings out for me is, when I have these conversations, and there are these great examples, you've both shared great examples there. What do we draw from that in terms of the wider potential for delivering real change from this kind of approach, whether it's convening roles, community organizers, investment upstream, as you're talking about? What's the potential if we can get this stuff to actually work?
I mean, for me, I think it's the potential to start to stem the demand. So it's the potential for improvement in the quality of the service provision, the number of people who need to access our services, the number of people, like, we've got a very crisis response based statutory sector. So we kind of have just got to a place by which we can just about basically deal with someone in crisis. But what we're trying to do when we're thinking about how do you shift the emphasis on getting upstream, more into prevention, more into stopping people for, you know, and this is an age-old debate. This isn't new. Like, I've been in the sector 30 years, and I was certainly discussing this in year one of joining, right? So we've always known this is our role. The problem is, I completely agree with Polly. I think as charities, we often get sucked into saying, yeah, but there's a person here right now in front of me that is desperate, absolutely desperate. You know, you've got a carer who is threatening to kill themselves and the person they care for today, like going like, oh, you know, we need to change the system around mental health support for these people. That ain't the answer to that couple there and then. So we get dragged into that. And I think it is that the potential for us to say that we were never, you know, this has been so well rehearsed, but we are never going to deal with this. However big our sector can get, we are never going to deal with all the demand in the process. The best role we play as a sector is to hold the state to account for what it provides. We bring a richness of evidence, of quality, of voice, of experience. You know, we empower the people we serve to speak up, our advocacy roles, our data. We need to see that the role of the sector is not rescuing the individual on the ground, although we'll always do that because we're always going to be there for that. It's core to how many of us were founded. But our role is to hold the state to account, not by naming and shaming, but by pointing out consistently, accurately, evidence-based how improvements, even if they are tiny, can stem the flow of the crisis and get us in earlier. So for me, that's the potential. The potential is to stem the flow. And it's really hard and complicated. And if we've been talking about it forever, why haven't we done it? I think we have done it. And I think if we never have existed as a sector, we've been a damn sight worse place than we are now. So I think we have done it. I think it's hard to tell. You know, if you avert a crisis, you never know what that crisis was going to feel like. I think we are doing it. I think we're doing it all day, every day. But for me, it is about, you know, not losing sight that is our role. That is our role. That is our primacy. That's how we'll change the world. Even if that individual, you know, in Lincolnshire this evening, you know, our dementia advisors are stopping them having the worst possible experience of their life, the way we'll change the world is changing the system. So, I mean, I feel really strongly about how you balance that immediate care, the rescuing. It is needed. You know, for all the charities working in that space, we couldn't walk away tomorrow from that and just focus on upstream. But how do you get that balance? And one other thing I was going to add is, and it is a challenge, is about the way we're funded makes us also quite short term. It's quite hard to be thinking about system change, which might pay off in 10 years' time when some of your staff don't know if they're going to be made redundant next Friday, right? And you don't know if you can make pay bill at Christmas. And so many of us in our organisations are living hand to mouth. You know, certainly a lot of the organisations we work in partnership with, really, really tough funding times at the moment across the sector. You know, this is when you do want to be going upstream because you can't meet demand, but it's the hardest time to work upstream. So how you balance some of those challenges, I think it's some of our toughest roles as chief execs.
Totally. And I think it's very, very difficult to, there's that dilemma of, I remember when soon after I joined Shelter and I was kind of going around our different local services, and someone said to me, oh, you know, I can't sleep at night because of all the people that I know I haven't been able to help today. And I thought, oh my God, you will never sleep then. Like, we will never help everybody that needs to be helped. And somehow we've got to support our people in that, you know, the finiteness of our resources, and the fact that, you know, if we don't devote quite a lot of our resources to that upstream work that Kate's talking about, then we're actually stocking up, you know, we're actually making even worse that whole kind of treadmill of meeting demand, which is actually, when it comes down to it, impossible. And that's,
and by then people have already suffered. People have already had the crisis a lot of the time by then, haven't they?
Well, that's right. And Kate's also right that this is not a new debate. You know, I remember even when, you know, before I joined the sector, even when I was a journalist, I was writing articles about people, you know, proving social investment, and people proving about how much you'd save public services by spending X amount on whatever preventive initiative it was. And actually, we have seen that demonstrated in, for example, Sure Start programs, which did save money to the rest of the public sector, by investing in early years provision and much more kind of upstream services. But of course, what then happened is they became, as resources got squeezed, they became more and more another service for families in the worst possible situation and in the worst possible crises. And people who were in less of a crisis could no longer access Sure Start. And there's a royal lesson there in how if you're not really careful, every investment that's made in prevention gets kind of dragged and sucked into that crisis management. And it is definitely our responsibility to A, not just do that ourselves, but B, to point that out when it's happening as well, and be really clear about the impact of this kind of constantly lurching from one crisis to another.
And it goes, I think, to I can't quite remember who said it. It may have been you, Polly. The best role that we can play. What is the best role that we can play? What is the role we have to play? I mean, we've started moving into the big challenges, and I'll just go through them in a second. But I wonder sometimes whether we're a little bit glass half empty, in the sense that we can look at areas where, we have seen big sort of structural systemic change. I think Juliet mentioned where we are with smoking, for example, which is close to hurting, and the big shifts on that. If you look, I was just sort of thinking that 60 years ago, in this sort of going forward and back, as you were saying, with some of these things like Sure Starts, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But when Alan Turing, everybody knows the story of Alan Turing and chemical castration. That's only 60 years ago, and then there was an awful lot of progress, and then we had the AIDS epidemic, and there was a huge sort of like pushback, and Section 28 and all the sort of stuff came in, and then where are we now? We're not in a perfect place, but we're in a place which is almost unrecognizable from where we were.
And I mean, yes, and there's countless examples of that. Rape in marriage was legal in my adult lifetime as a woman. Now it isn't. When I was at Women's Aid, we campaigned for coercive control to be made a crime. It is a crime now. There are convictions happening around that. So I think
so we can do this stuff.
And Sally Challen was released because of that. And that was a real significant landmark case. So there's lots of progress that we've made, and I think it is really important to recognise that. And actually, I mean, I don't know about being glass half empty. I don't know how you could survive as a charity chief exec if you're a glass half empty person. I think you'd literally be on your knees, frankly. I just don't think that's possible.
Martyn, can I just pick up a really good point that Chris has made, which is how do you take your organisation from being in a reactive space to a systemic change?
Please.
Just because we did a little exercise that I thought it really, I think, helped my team get their head into a bit of different thinking space when we did a piece of strategy work recently, which is we said, if in 2050 we have a crystal ball, and what we can see is in 2050 the government is going to outlaw the UK voluntary sector. It is going to close all charities, all commercial, all community interest companies. There is going to be no voluntary sector, no third sector allowed in the UK in 2050. If you knew your charity was closing on the 1st of January 2050, so you've got 26 years, what do you do differently today to be in the best possible place for your beneficiaries on the 1st of January 2050? And actually, it really focuses the mind that if we continue being in a completely reactive, responsive pace and position, they will just drop off a cliff.
That is genius. I love that.
I know, and it is a really interesting way of thinking, because if you think actually they would drop off a cliff that first morning, like, oh my God. So you start preparing to stop people dropping off a cliff on the 1st of January 2050, and say, what would we have to do for them to not drop off a cliff on the 1st of Jan 2050? It really helps you strategically start to plan slightly differently, because you start thinking, God, by 2035, we've got to sort out early diagnosis. People have got to be able to get a diagnosis, because if we're not around to encourage them to get one, how are we going to do this? You know, we need more disease modifying treatments in the system for dementia. We need to start our research investments in them now, and we could drop some of that other stuff that we're doing. Even some tough decisions here. We might drop some stuff around some health inequality stuff, or we might drop, you know, tough choices. Yeah. But we would make these choices slightly differently if we knew we were not allowed to exist for our beneficiaries from that set date. And it's quite shifted our thinking strategically, and our new strategy that we're going to be launching early in the new year is, you know, it's going to be about early. It's going to be about earlier diagnosis, earlier prevention of crisis, not early response to crisis. It's going to be about early careers. It's going to be about early investment in partnerships. And it is, you know, it's going to be about early. And that thinking has emerged from challenging ourselves backwards from thinking, if we couldn't be here, what would we do if we knew we just got 6 months or a year or 2 years? And it's just a different way of thinking.
It's a much more exciting framing of that thing about we should be trying to put ourselves out of business, isn't it? Which is a bit of a like old chestnut in the charity sector. But that's like such a good way, because that is quite similar to our thinking, actually, because our big campaign call is about building enough social housing so that people on a low income can actually afford to live in a decent home. And if that happens, by the end of the parliament, we get to the 90,000 social homes a year, then actually within 10 years of that, the need for shelter would be radically different. So not only would it matter less if we weren't allowed to exist, we actually would probably be, anyway, an incredibly different organisation. And I suppose that goes back to the bit I said at the beginning about not being there to prop up failed systems, because actually, you know, you've got to be able to say if that we're not scared of making an intervention that makes the need for us much less. And that's got to be right, surely. It can't.
Yeah. It's also like, isn't this why we all do it? Don't we all do it to change the world? Don't we all do it to end the devastation dementia causes? I don't want to just end a little bit of the devastation. I want it gone. So actually that, I think one of the things that's been really kind of releasing on this kind of framing in the terms of thinking about it in relation to system change is people thinking, shit, we could do this. We could end the devastation caused by dementia by 2050 if we just say, you know, take some of those tough decisions about some people are going to be struggling now. How do we feel about that? We hate it. We can't sleep in our beds. But the end game, eyes on the prize, end game, we've got to work towards that.
There's a huge internal change piece, though, and I think some people are referring to that in the chat, that, you know, there's a big journey to take people on internally to shift to being that kind of different type of organisation.
And the tensions are huge. And I mean, one of the tensions we're finding is between
trustees,
volunteers who are engaged in the delivery of today's rescuing activities.
Totally.
You know, how does that fit in an organisation which wants to go much more upstream? So there are a set of tensions that play out.
Yes, and it's not a path to embark on. Kind of, it's not always going to make you liked as a chief exec.
No, but this is exactly. I mean, this is where I wanted the conversation to go next. I could just sit here and not say anything, because this is a wonderful conversation just to listen to. I think there is something about, you know, you mentioned the word end games, you know, and that framing of the end game. What is the end game, and are we serious about wanting? Is it a nice old chestnut about wanting to no longer exist, or oh yeah, if we were serious about that, what would we do differently? And I think it speaks to another seductive thing. Polly, you talked about seductive quick wins, but there is a seduction to having people depend on you. And it's a sort of psychological thing that kind of sits in there with rescuing. But what you do with that exercise of looking, if we couldn't exist in 26 years' time, it makes you confront the amount of dependency that there is upon your organization existing right now. And sometimes that can be quite comfortable for people within the organization. And also
people, well, you know, people get a lot of satisfaction from the immediate difference they make, and from feeling that, you know, they are needed. And if you, you know, people choose the careers they choose for lots and lots of different reasons, but a lot of people, I think, choose to work for organizations like ours because they want to feel every day that they're making a difference. And the quickest way to feel that is by, you know, helping somebody who's in a really awful situation. That's not a criticism, by the way,
no, it's perfectly legitimate, isn't it?
Colleagues who are motivated by that, because, you know, it's absolutely natural, and in some ways it's right and proper that people want that, but it's our job as leaders to take a step back from that, isn't it? And to try to reconcile these real complexities of, you know, how we do what we think is how we lead our organizations to be the organizations that we think they should be, and also support our people who are in it. A lot of them are in it to help people day to day, and there's nothing wrong with that. So it's a very, I think it's a very complicated leadership task.
I mean, I think there are some of the ways around some of that though is even talking to those people who are motivated day to day by just doing their amazing job, like our dementia advisors. We've got about 700 dementia advisors, just amazing folks out there all day every day. But I just recently had a conversation with them saying, do you know what the most incredible thing you do is? And they were like, yeah, you know, we work with families. We sort of was like, yeah, you generate loads and loads of data that our policy team take away, turn into really, really strong bits of evidence to persuade government to put a lot more money into UK social care. Because we use the data of who you're, obviously, you know, anonymized, but who you're working with, how long you're spending on them, how many safeguarding cases you're dealing with, you know, how many people you're dealing with in self-neglect, how many people have got no adult children, and yet, you know, the systems we're devising around technology, we've got no adult children to show you how to use that tech. They're just dropping out the system. All that you cut back and you write up in your case notes, you know, mining that data, that's one of the most incredible things you do. And they were like, oh,
definitely. We've had a similar, yeah, we've had the same conversation. And that, I guess that was the point I was saying about making those individual stories count for something.
Yeah.
Making those voices count for something. Absolutely right. Yeah.
And you've got to be able to tell the story of system change, which incorporates everybody. And again, Juliet said something last time which really resonated with me, which was talking about her own organisation, so Stroke Association, being a system and not forgetting that. You know, so how do you work in the terms of as a system in your own organisation? How is where people have more than one activity, but where does your frontline work? How is that feeding your policy team? How is that feeding your decisions on research? How are you using what your teams are finding out on the ground to give to another organization? Give that data away. Say, hey, we don't work in the policy space, but we know this problem, and here's the voice of people living with your condition. You know, give that evidence away. Let someone else change the system. You can still contribute to system change, even if you are not a system change organization, if you think about the way your organization is set up as a system in itself, it just really triggered something for me last time.
Yes, and I think there's another thing there about authenticity, isn't there? And so for a real live example at Shelter, we're doing a piece of work about race discrimination in housing, and the way we've done it is to take also that research into our services and to find out, are Black people and people of colour equally able to access shelter? If not, why not? What do we need to do to make our services not part of what is a racist and discriminatory housing system? And we need to be really open and honest about the fact that, you know, we've done this piece of work. It will undoubtedly, I don't think it's kind of spoiling the press release to say it will show that housing is highly discriminatory. But what's important about it as well is that we've turned that lens on ourselves. And we're being really honest about where we are also part of that, and trying to think through how we need to change as a result of that. And that's really important. If you're going to start talking about how everybody needs to change, you can't do that without, you know, being prepared to turn that lens inward.
It's kind of
but also what they're learning from that. So just saying, hey, where's shelter? And we've worked out that this thing we do has become discriminatory. If you're doing the same thing, you've probably got the same problem. So it's how, you know, you can take that learning.
No, sharing it. Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So on this, a couple of big things that have been coming out. And we talked about, you know, the seduction piece, whether it's around quick wins or whether it's around staying downstream and rescuing and saving. And we talked about the stories and the narratives and how we frame those choices of quick wins or helping versus changing, and what our role is within that. We've also talked a few times, and it's also come up in the chat, around money and how the money is driving certain behaviors, whether it's within the system or whether it's in the way that we respond to it. And the other thing that we've specifically talked about here is the chief exec's role, the role of the leader in leading people in this upstream journey when there are clearly other forces pushing our attention consistently back downstream, and not just ours, but the other organizations around them. So just on that final point, on the leadership piece, what have you learned about your own leadership? You know, how would you contrast it now versus what we might typically understand as kind of traditional leadership?
I'll let Polly go first.
Oh, cheers.
Oh, Polly, what have we learned?
What have we learned? Oh, not enough, I'm sure. So I think it goes back to that point about being able to recognize where you yourself are not helping, and be really honest about that. And that both your organization and you as a leader. So I think that is really important. I mean, I think it certainly for me, it's really led me to think a lot about not only it started me off really examining my own privilege and thinking about that very seriously in the context of my role at Shelter. But it's almost led me to think actually about leadership in the sector in general. And actually, it would be much better if nice white middle class people like me weren't running all the charities, especially those that are explicitly social justice charities like Shelter. So there's definitely that. And I think it's definitely made me, if you're gonna challenge people to work in such a different way, you've really got to be willing to listen open-heartedly, sort of thing, to the reasons why they find it really difficult, because people do find it really difficult. And so I think there's a really important piece there. But I don't think any of this is particularly new. I mean, I think leading charities nowadays requires a totally different leadership style from what, you know, I'm pretty old, but when the first leadership training I ever went on was basically in this kind of really sort of heroic, very male kind of model of leadership. It was very much like follow me chaps kind of mentality. And, you know, I initially struggled with it, but I mean, I just completely tried my absolute hardest to be like that. And I actually think what we're doing now is letting a different sort of leader grow and breathe and really be themselves within our sector. And if that means there's less room for some of the rest of us, so be it.
What are your thoughts, Kate? What are your reflections on leadership?
I think for me, it's it's like two ends of the spectrum. One is the day I don't believe I can change it is the day, you know, I need to pack up my laptop. Like you have to, the role of a chief exec particularly is that you're constantly selling in a vision, a longer term vision that is better. It's going to be better. It will be better. Our intervention today will be more than a plug. It will make it better. You've got to sell that all day, every day, to staff, donors, beneficiaries, the media, whoever, and you've got to believe it. You've got to be able to be truly right in your core, like a stick of rock, believe that there will be a day when dementia will not devastate lives, and Alzheimer's Society will have contributed to it. It won't have only been our work, then the whole of society will have done it, but it will happen. So I think you've got to hold that as a leader. You've got to have that in your heart, and the day you haven't is the day you might be not in the right cause. But I think at the other end, you've got to be able to balance that as a leader with thinking, you know, what that whole analogy about, you know, throwing starfish back in the sea when there's hundreds stranded on the shore, and saying, well, oh my God, but there's all these starfish stranded on the shore and I'm throwing this one in. Well, for that one, right, it mattered. For that one, it matters. That one you're saving today, you didn't save those 999, but you've saved that one. And so being able to balance those two things, holding that big vision that we can do this with, and if all we do today is make one teeny little change, we just improve the lives of one person, that's okay. We're good people trying our best, and for today that was the best we could do. It will add up to something bigger. So I think for leadership these days, it's so much about hope and just constantly feeding in the hope, because everything can feel so negative and oppressive for our staff, for our beneficiaries, for our donors. Everything is squashing them down. And that's hard. And how do we look after ourselves in that? Because actually playing that chief cheerleader role constantly can be absolutely exhausting. Can be exhausting when we don't have all the answers.
And we're in a world of huge polarization, and our organizations are open to that. We're porous, aren't we, as organizations? And so I think that piece around self-knowledge and really understanding how you, as a leader or just as a person, hold your own, true to yourself, through this incredibly kind of polarized environment is really, really important. And that's that hope piece. So, you know, you're able to do that because you really, really believe, fundamentally believe in what you're doing, as Kate says. But it is really important, I think, to have the confidence and as I say, the self-knowledge to kind of hold to that through what are incredibly difficult and polarized situation. You know, the world is a hard place.
You are both wonderful examples of that, and thank you, because that's a very optimistic and uplifting note to end on. There is a huge amount of opportunity here. It's stuff that we've been looking at for a long time, but it feels that there is so much to learn. There is so much happening, particularly at local levels, etc. I just want to thank you both enormously for going into that with me and sharing it with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that all of you who joined found it useful. Just a reminder, if you've not registered yet, our next session will be looking at one of those issues. So the issue around money. Tuesday, the 19th of November, I will be in the company of Neil Heslop, who's Chief Exec of Charities Aid Foundation. They distribute £1 billion a year. And Richard Hawkes, I'd probably mentioned around social investment, the sort of large scale social investment around systems change that British Asian Trust under Richard's leadership are doing in India is fascinating. And we'll be looking at all of that in 3 weeks' time. So if you're not registered, please do. We've got lots more fascinating stuff to discuss. But thank you, Kate. Thank you, Polly. That was fantastic. And hopefully I will see many of you next session on the 19th of November. I look forward to seeing you there. Take care.